Hey everyone, we are going to get started in a few minutes. I will just let everyone file in. If you're already here and if you'd like to put any discussion questions in the chat, you can do that now. Hope everyone's having a good Wednesday. I have no sense of days anymore. Although I think this class will help with that because I have way more structure than when I was doing an admin job before this, and the days got very blurry. Okay, we're at 14 people and we had 30 yesterday, so I'm just going to give it a few extra minutes just in case people are having trouble getting in. I will again say that you are absolutely free to kind of mix and match synchronous versus asynchronous. Oh, we got a question from someone. That's a good question. Okay, I'm gonna read this out loud. This is such a good question. Is the intent of these questions to explain certain concepts we may not understand, or can they be questions that may initiate a conversation from a sociological perspective? Either. Those are both really great, I would say, examples of things a discussion question might do. So a discussion question can be you asking a question that you think will kind of prompt discussion, sociologically around gender. It can also be a question about something you did not understand. As we keep going, you might also get questions that kind of compare. So something might come up in a week, in one day, that reminds you of a previous lecture or reading. So you might want to ask a question that kind of invites like a comparison and contrast. I'm getting just a few more and I'm going to note them. Oh, getting an email. Oh. I'm going to turn off my phone. Oh, it's already off. Good for me. Okay. Okay, so we're going to get started. We have so much to do today, which is exciting because we're watching a movie, and I'm also definitely going to talk to you about the readings, and then I would like us a chance to have a discussion. So we'll likely get pretty close to the full time. And I'm just going to try and move as quickly as possible because I want to leave time for a discussion. I don't want to burn you out before we get there. Before I get started, one of the discussion questions that was loaded, I think might be more about yesterday. It's a question that asks, can I explain what binary means? It's a great question, and it's important that we kind of have a foundation of that as we move forward. So binary basically refers to any kind of system in which there are only two options. So if we talk about gender being binary, it means that gender is either male or female. That, you know, like everyone is either one or the other, so that there's nothing in between, and there's no kind of blending of those things. Like bi means two, so binary. If you think of like binary code, which is a code in like computers, math stuff, binary code is 0 or 1. So like the whole language is made up of zeros and ones. So there's only two options for forms of communication. So again, a gender binary would be one or the other, male or female. And this contrasts with something like a more fluid understanding of gender. You might have heard the expression like gender is a spectrum, which means that it's not just kind of two fixed points, but, you know, at one side there is, you know, male, at one side there's female, and then there's actually quite a bit of overlap and fluidity in between. So it's not just one or the other. Binary basically means one or the other. Would be another way to say that. Oh, I'm getting a new message. Okay. So I'm going to start by summarizing the readings for this week. I'm going to try and move a little faster today just because I do, the movie's about an hour and a half. So I'm very mindful of that. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Here it comes. Share. Amazing. Okay. So today we are talking about feminism. I do want to first address before we get started. Actually, no. First, I will talk about key terms, and then I'll do the thing I was about to do. So some key terms for today that I want you to keep an eye out for are, maybe not surprisingly, feminism, sexism, positionality, reformation versus revolution, and the phrase, the personal is political. So just, I would take a minute and jot those down and just kind of keep your ear and eye open for those. Those should be addressed both in the readings and also the movie. I want to talk about positionality right off the get-go. I believe I mentioned this yesterday, or possibly even the day before. It's all getting kind of blurry, but that's good. Positionality is the concept that, I'm going to use myself as an example. My identity, my experiences, my knowledge impact the way I kind of interact with the topic. It speaks to my biases. It speaks to kind of like what is more like emotionally charged for me. So for example, my positionality in this conversation is that like I am a cis white queer male who's going to teach you about feminism today. And that, I mean, all positionality matters, and all of our experiences will impact the way we engage with the topic. But I do want to address the fact that for a lot of this, I'm coming at it from an outside perspective. My firsthand experience of sexism is pretty limited because I have quite a bit of male privilege. It's a little complicated as a queer man, but it's not, you know, I still very much experience that privilege. And moving forward in this class, we are talking about the way gender intersects with racism, colonialism, violence against women. Those are things I am coming at from an outside perspective. And I'm very aware of that. So, I mean, I think it's really important with anything we study. There's also weeks we're going to talk about, or days we're going to talk about like queerness and sexuality. And my positionality does kind of pivot there because for that, I do have some firsthand experience. It's a useful topic in any kind of sociological conversation. It's a useful topic in gender because we all come at this information, at these lectures from unique positions. Our experience is going to influence the way we see that. Biases are kind of unavoidable, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just really important that we're aware of that effect. So the last thing I'll just say on that is I'm aware of my my identity and the fact that there are going to be moments where like I am a white guy who's going to be explaining racism to a group of adults, some of which are people of color. So I'm aware of the power optics of that and the kind of, yeah. But this is not about my life experience. I think it is important to see me in this role as your course instructor in general, as a resource rather than an expert. Because I'm an academic, because this is my career, I have had the privilege to do a lot of academic research, and I'm able to gather a lot of sources that I can share with you. But a big part of my lecture is actually foregrounding the voices I've collected. So we are reading the work of a lot of people with firsthand experience because I'm trying to center those voices rather than my own. I've also put a lot of documentaries on the syllabus. And that's intentional. The fact that I mean, I always teach a lot of movies just because my background is very media centric. But in a class like this, I'm conscious that I want to be centering and elevating voices of people, again, with firsthand experience. So we're not just watching movies, we're watching documentaries that will, pass the mic essentially to people whose experience of like feminist activism and sexism and racism is firsthand. So that's kind of a little peek behind the window pedagogically. Now, the flip side of that is as a cis gay male, I still participate in feminism, and definitely as a gay man, my life has been really transformed by feminism, and I will get to that in a bit. But we'll get rolling. So the first reading we looked at today is Bell Hooks, and I just wanted to take a minute to introduce you to Bell Hooks. Bell Hooks is an incredibly important figure in feminist discourse, in critical race discourse. And her writing has had a lot of resonances also within queer theory. Bell Hooks has like so many really prolific books. The one I probably teach the most is Black Looks, and she looks at the optics of racism in culture with a lot of discussion of media. She's written a lot of really powerful books. I think today in general, I'm going to be dropping a lot of names, and we may not get back to a lot of these names in a lot of detail in this class, but in the way that this is a survey class and this is kind of a sample platter for you, jot down Bell Hooks. And if you really, really respond to this writing, she is a great person to seek out. Also, as you may have noticed, she lowercaseifies the first letter in both her names, and that is a very intentional choice. This is a pen name. Hooks does this as a conscious way to draw attention to the fact that she's trying to center the knowledge and her work, and really kind of trying to like trouble the notion of the author being kind of like the fact that like her identity and her kind of status as an authority is not as important as the work, that the work is the real star, the work is capitalized. So Bell Hooks starts her piece, Feminism is for Everyone, talking about feminist prejudices. And she specifically brings up the concept of the feminist as being stereotyped as man-hating, brings up the concept of feminism as being associated with lesbianism, and also talks about the fact of the concept of a killjoy, which we'll get to more later. And I think this is a really interesting place to start. This text is written in 2000. And so I wanted to draw our attention here. A feminist text, a feminist text written in the 1950s, 60s, or 70s probably wouldn't start here. So I think it's really important that Hooks is really aware of the history of optics around feminism, and so much of her work is now combating the legacy of anti-feminist practice because feminism has become so stigmatized, that patriarchy has been really successful in silencing feminism by making it seem unattractive, unlikable, undesirable, to the point where even people who don't really know a lot about feminism know that it's a word they don't want to be associated with. So Hooks kind of talks about the fact that a lot of this perception is the fact that feminist is seen as being anti-male in a really kind of hysterical and unreasonable kind of way. And in reality, feminism is functionally about ending oppression and sexism, primarily for women, because women are primarily on the receiving end of patriarchal forms of oppression. This is a graphic I really like, and it's, if you can't see it, if you're not watching us today, it's two images side by side. First is a woman with kind of the female sign, and she's holding it like an axe, and she's about to decapitate a man. And it says what society thinks feminism is. And beside it is a woman holding the feminist sign like an axe, same image, but she's actually about to chop off a shackle with a ball and chain around her ankle. And it says, this is what feminism actually is. So feminism is fundamentally about ending oppression. It's not a violent reaction towards men. I really like this piece is that Hooks does address where this prejudice comes from, and that like particularly second wave feminists in the early 60s and 70s did have a lot of justifiable anger and resentment towards men. A lot of people who had done the act of oppressing were men. A lot of people who benefit from sexism and thus have either a passive or an active investment in kind of quelching feminism were men. A lot of the issues surrounding feminist politics have to do with autonomy of women's bodies, violence, and these are things that have been perpetrated by men. So while feminism is not like at its core about punishing men, and it's definitely not to say that like if someone says, hi, I'm a feminist, they have not just said to you, hi, I hate men, and want to destroy them all. That's not a one-to-one ratio, but understandably there is anger from a lot of experienced and inherited violence and trauma. So it doesn't come from nowhere, but it's a gross oversimplification, especially of a political movement, but also of individual people. Another really powerful tool in kind of anti-feminist prejudice is media. And I think maybe the most common one that we see, and we still see this so often, is the idea of the quote, feminist killjoy. There are so many good articles on feminist killjoys. If you want to read them, I will send them to you. But some reasonably contemporary sources. There's a bit of an age gap, so I don't always have the most contemporary of sources, but I'll just kind of go around the circle here. So I've got some images of Haley from American Dad. Is a pretty on the nose literally cartoon, but cartoonish feminist killjoy. Like her role in the family is to not be fun, to suck the fun out of the room. She's always going to protests. People kind of talk about having less fun around her. Alex Dunphy on Modern Family is really similar. Alex is less verbally a feminist. She doesn't necessarily talk about feminism by name, but her vibe is that she's really smart, she's really ambitious, she works really hard. She doesn't ascribe to typical gender roles like her sister, and she's no fun. There's actually a scene where she's away for the summer, and her whole family's had the best summer ever, and she comes home and like, you know, the world kind of falls apart because she's just in the room. 10 Things I Hate About You is a movie from the 90s, which you might be aware of, about an angry feminist who is essentially broken and learns to love a man. Liz Lemon is an interesting feminist character because she's kind of problematic, but also kind of gets represented as the no fun mom character. Lisa Simpson is interesting because even though Lisa is often portrayed really positively, part of Lisa's vibe is making waves, complaining a lot. So we see an image of Lisa saying, come on, who wants to complain with me? That's her idea of fun. Britta Perry is also a pretty great anti-feminist model on Community, because again, her thing is being the worst. She's also kind of depicted as being kind of insincerely radical. She's kind of doing it for the attention, that she's not super well informed on her issues, that it is kind of performative. All these things tie in together. I also just want to point out here that that all of these examples, and really the majority of examples I can think of, are white feminists. There is historically and contemporarily a perception that feminism is something that's specifically for white women, and that really serves as a substantial barrier for women of color, both entering into feminist spaces and groups, but also in terms of accessing some of the goals of feminism. Very often, gender equality can be put at odds with racial equality, and that is that's very problematic. And that's a thread we're going to follow for a few lectures. But Hooks kind of ties it up by saying, you know, we should have a definition feminism, because so many people she encounters don't really know what feminism is. They just know they don't like it. And they're basing it on a lot of stereotypes. So feminism is a movement to end sexism, sexist exploitation, and oppression. Full stop. Write it down. The other thing Hooks brings up is the word patriarchy. I talked about this yesterday. And I mean, we've reached a point in pop culture now where patriarchy just gets talked about so often. It's almost kind of a pun buzzword. I've already talked about Bimini von Boulash twice in this class, and we're already on the third lecture. So what does that say? But Bimini was a drag contestant on UK Drag Race. And when she did her stand-up act, she kind of came out and said, like, you all look so sexy, you make me want to dismantle the patriarchy. And I mean, I really like Bimini. I think her politics are fantastic. But she is kind of like playing for a laugh here. The idea that dismantling the patriarchy would have anything to do with fun and being sexy. And I think she is kind of trying to be subversive in tying those two things together, but it does imply that when we think of we're just here to have fun and be sexy, we don't usually think let's dismantle the patriarchy. So again, really briefly, patriarchy is institutional sexism. It is something that's socialized, which we talked about yesterday, but it's also very much internalized, which means that both men and women who grow up in a patriarchal society, at a certain point, like it keeps being reinforced, but we also learn to internalize it. So many women report that they often feel guilty for speaking up for themselves. That's a form of patriarchy. Or men feel literally unable to express emotion, especially of our own vulnerability. And that's a form of kind of internalized patriarchy. So it's not even that we start self-policing our own gender roles in lines with the patriarchal system. So again, Hooks makes a pretty good case for this, and I think it's really important, both historically and contemporarily, that feminism and feminism's goal of dismantling patriarchy is beneficial to everyone, and that men actually do suffer under patriarchy. They also get a lot of perks. The patriarchy does reward men, but there's lots of reasons that men should be invested in dismantling the patriarchy. So men are rewarded for dominating women. For being abusive towards women, for erasing women, and for treating women in a sexist way, which is active. They're also rewarded for just ignoring that. So a man might be uncomfortable, but if he doesn't actually take part in standing up for feminism, in kind of addressing sexism, and just kind of like opts out, he's still rewarded for that passivity. And that's still a form of passively being involved in the patriarchy, whereas men are punished for challenging the patriarchy. So someone who is kind of assigned male at birth and even identifies as a man potentially, if they express their gender in a way that contradicts the patriarchy, if they embrace sensitivity, if they want to be effeminate, if they want to be vulnerable, if they want to behave in a way that kind of denaturalizes the patriarchy, because the patriarchy is like kind of sensitive that way and like very fragile in the sense that it does not allow for a lot of plasticity. It kind of requires very strict rules. And so men that challenge that and maybe suggest that male gender roles and their superiority aren't natural and innate get punished, because that's like getting up in the patriarchy's face. They don't like that. The last thing I want to talk about with Hooks brings up the idea of reform versus revolution in feminism. And this is a pretty core concept. It's important to note that Hooks self-identifies as a revolutionary feminist. Simply put, reformist feminism emphasizes equality and the idea that the problem with the status quo, the way the world is today, is that women do not have access to the same things that men do. And so the goal of feminism should be, you know, men are here and we just need to get women up here. The system is not necessarily bad, other than the fact that women don't have the same access to it. Revolutionary feminism is about the fact that the system itself is sexist, racist, classism, and needs to be transformed. So it's not just about, you know, if we think of the metaphor of like there's a gate around the country club, and the goal of reformist feminism is to let women in through the gate so they can also enter the country club, whereas revolutionaries say like, no, the country club is a bad place and should be dismantled, and the resources that were put into building the country club should be distributed. We should build a new building, we should have like new laws, and so those can be quite polarizing in terms of the goal. of feminism. So revolutionary feminism receives far less media attention, both in terms of its coverage in movements, but also in terms of popular representations of it. Women's liberation, which is a term for kind of the activism of second wave feminism in the 60s and 70s, holds much public imagination and is largely conceived of as reformist feminism. So it's about acquiring rights, and not necessarily about questioning larger parts of the system, like questioning the validity of the prison industrial complex, or questioning the way that capitalism governs our lives and works. Another example, so feminists in pop culture, when we do see kind of strong feminist characters, they are usually depicted as more in the reformist camp. So the examples I've given here are Mindy Kaling's character on the Mindy Project, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, Leslie Knope, and more recently, the Queen's Gambit, which kind of blew up on Netflix over the summer. I think that was the summer. Was that already last summer? Again, so like I mean, I love these characters. I really, really love. I've watched like the Mindy Project and Parks and Rec kind of over and over and over. I love Mrs. Maisel. But again, these are shows about women kind of really succeeding in male-dominated industries, but totally buying into the system. These are not about dismantling. Like Mindy is not, dismantling sexism or just kind of like the nature of the medical health field. She is working really hard and doing really well in a male-dominated field. And so it's great. And I think she is a great figure, but it's not a revolutionary take on feminism. And I don't know a lot of really kind of revolutionary references to pop culture. I mean, I think one example might be Sam on Dear White People is much more in a revolutionary feminist camp. Her focus is more on racial politics, obviously, but in terms of her like really addressing systemic equality, I mean, that show has much less broad appeal, and partly because its politics are a lot more direct than, say, something like Parks and Rec, which is a lot gentler about its political engagement. But anyway, I should go faster. Okay, I'm going to try and speed through this. So the second reading is What Has Feminism Done for Me Lately? And the me should be in brackets, I apologize, by Victoria Bromley. I want to clock again this style. In the same way that Hooks starts off by talking about prejudice, Bromley actually starts sarcastically. The first paragraph, to be clear, is meant to be sarcastic when she talks about the like, feminism is over because we fixed it, guys. And this, again, I think is kind of a tongue-in-cheek reference to the fact that like feminism, which has been around, I mean, like second wave feminism and the women's liberation movement is over 50 years old. And if we go all the way back to a suffragette movement, we're well over, coming up on 200 years ish. And so, and most people will often kind of say that like people are more or less equal and like equality is like, we're getting there. And that's not really the case if we look at the statistics and we look at the history. And so Bromley's question again is she kind of talks about the fact that in a class she asked her students who's a feminist and like 10% of people raised their hand, but then she asked them like who believes in equality, who believes in like healthcare and reproductive rights, who believes in child support and child services, and of course most people raise their hand. And so there's that disconnect of like people don't like the word and there's an image of feminism, but when you kind of break down the reality, there's a disconnect. So she takes a slightly different track than Hooks. And Bromley talks about this form of, I don't think she uses the term, but I like the term cultural amnesia. So very often part of the reason that people have a negative understanding of feminism for Bromley is that they don't actually understand everything that feminism has done for us. So there's a list of things that feminism, like very direct feminist action, has given us. So for example, the fact that like women can vote, women can join workforces. In most parts, in the West, in most fields, it is you can't get fired for getting pregnant. That was very much a thing. There are at least policies against sexual harassment. There is much more access to affordable childcare. Divorce, if you're a woman, you can legally divorce a husband without his permission, and you have some legal recourse to that. You are essentially considered an equal party in that legal battle. Birth control is accessible. Abortions are an ongoing issue, but again, it is something that even like 60 years ago was completely illegal, and there was no legal access to. So part of Bromley's discussion here is that part of the way patriarchy and sexism have made feminism seem undesirable is by kind of erasing all the things it's done. And we really do take for granted so much of those things. Like, of course, women can vote. And it's like, okay, but like if you think that that should always be the case, that actually was not a given, that's something people fought for really, really hard for a long time. And so like, you know, if you think women should be able to vote, send feminism a thank you note. I did not mean to rhyme there. So the other thing Bromley talks about is the role that, sorry, I'm just bringing up my notes, the role that other like activist movements in the mid 20th century played in the feminist movement. So like in the late 50s through to the 70s, in general, there was multiple social justice movements. Generally speaking, this grows out of, and we can kind of see the anti-war movement as generating a lot of interest in this. Like why kind of Western culture starts all of a sudden to kind of embrace activism and why people start to fight back in really organized ways is a really complicated question. It has a lot to do actually with the expansion of universities. A lot of it is seeds that have been laid. So like, for example, like the suffragette movement starts in the 1800s and it's a slow build. A lot of more liberal activist movements get going in the 1930s, but then because of World War II and the Cold War, actually get kind of like taken a step back. So in a lot of ways, activism in the 60s is a deferral from the pre-war era. I'm going to talk a lot more about that when we talk about gay liberation. So what ends up happening in this time in history is that we have the anti-war movement, we have the civil rights movement, which is the rights of Black Americans and Canadians and other places in the West. We have the Indigenous rights movement, we have the gay liberation movement. And of course, women are involved in all of these movements because women are part of all of these communities. And so on the one hand, we get a certain amount of cross-pollination. Women involved in like the Black Panther movement learn about activism and learn about not only the ideology of civil rights, but also some of the strategies involved in civil rights. The same is true of Indigenous rights and gay liberation. But we also get a disenfranchisement because many of these movements actually perpetuate sexist stereotypes and sexist behavior. And that is kind of a real aha moment for a lot of early feminists to be part of a movement that says its thing is equality. But then within that equality movement, men are dominating women is a bit like, you know, a little too far and ends up being something of a consciousness raising moment. Second wave feminism talks about conscious raising a fair amount. It's a term, and it generally refers to the fact that most of the time, or a great deal of the time, again, because of the way oppression works, is people don't know they're being oppressed. It's very naturalized. And if you don't know the way you've been manipulated or brainwashed, you think this is just kind of normal in the way it is. And so consciousness raising generally refers to a moment in which you are able to recognize your own oppression and conceive of alternatives to it. I'm going to jump ahead because I do want to get to the movie, because the movie is going to talk to this a lot. But I did just want to offer a timeline of women's rights movement in Canada. This will be on the slide, so don't worry about jotting this down right now, but I wanted to give us, again, a sense of how far things have come. And certain things that we perhaps take for granted is just like, that's the way it should be. How recent some of this is. So, you know, for example, like the right to vote, fair pay legalization, Indigenous women getting the right to vote much, much later. The role that access to healthcare and particularly reproductive healthcare had on women, recognizing that it is possible that sexual assault and rape can happen within a marriage. The fact that if a woman is married to a man, the man cannot literally do whatever he wants to her. That 1983, that's pretty recent. And the second last thing I want to talk about with the Bromley reading is Bromley has this delightful list of, if, imagine a world without feminism. Um, a world without feminism would kind of look something like this. Marriage would be a woman's career de facto. Women would not be allowed to vote. Women could not divorce a man for anything less than like a very serious offense. And even then, because a woman would have very few legal rights, that would kind of be impossible. So, I mean, divorce might be possible in terms of like total abandonment. If a man disappeared from a woman's life, she could possibly find a divorce. But anything like assault, or like poor treatment, or just kind of not wanting to get married anymore, or absolutely not. Rape in marriage would not be a crime. It would be kind of unconceivable in legal terms. A man could have his wife committed to an institution with no questions asked. Stigma around unwed mothers and the children of unwed mothers would be career ending for the children, would carry huge stigma for the women. Fewer than half of women would work outside the home, earning about 52%. They would need the permission of their husbands or fathers to work. We would still have help wanted signs that were based on gender. Education would be segregated, no math or science for girls, no team sports for girls. If you get pregnant, you're expelled. Academic studies that look at both women's rights, the history of women, and many disciplines that have been made possible by the study of feminism. So the gay rights movement and the study of LGBT culture in academia would like not exist. And then we would have probably no representation of women in the media that was positive or aspirational, only stuff that reinforced gender stereotypes. And this is, again, largely because what allows women to represent themselves in media is that women are slowly able to occur positions of some authority in media jobs. So if all media conglomerates and artistic production are men, women have no agency in creating those stories. So as much as feminism has done a ton for women's rights, we are absolutely not living in a time of gender equality. Sexism still remains rampant. One argument Bromley made that I thought was really, that I had not thought about in my male privilege is that there's no birth control for men. Bromley talks about the fact that one of the reasons is that there's just not been sufficient testing because there would be some side effects for men. There are lots of side effects for women on birth control, but that it is simply assumed that women will take on this financial and physical labor for birth control, whereas men don't need to. Financially, on average, women still make about 32% less than men in Canada. That's as of this year. Two-thirds of people on minimum wage are women in Canada. There is still a significant amount of stigma on women entering male-dominated fields. Many careers are still very gendered. The representation of women in media is still narrow, objectified. We will talk about that tomorrow. Political leadership, especially at that national level, is overwhelmingly male. Sexual harassment and sexual assault remain prevalent. Almost 40% of Canadian women report being sexually assaulted, and we also keep in mind that that number is probably higher in reality because this is only people that come forward and formally report. So that's a very hard number to quantify, but that's pretty high for a projection. So before we get to the movie, I'm gonna stop sharing. I just want to open it up. Are there any, Bimini was robbed, absolutely. Are there any questions about the readings? Keep in mind that a lot of the movie is going to kind of cover some of the same stuff, but yeah, do we have any questions? You can type or you can out loud. I do see someone has pointed out there's a typo on my slide on women's liberation in Canada. Yes, it should be the 1920s to the 1940s. That was just a little typo. I'm sorry about that. Yes, today is Red Dress Day, which is a day of like visibility and protest for missing and murdered Indigenous women. Thank you for sharing that. So someone asked, is there any way in which women benefit from patriarchy? And if not, why do women deny this is an issue? Um, I mean, I think you could make an argument that some women in extremely privileged position can find an upside to patriarchal oppression. Um, but I think the much larger issue is that women are taught from a very early age that feminism is unattractive and unreasonable, and that patriarchy isn't natural. Many women who grow up in kind of very conservative environments are kind of taught to find pride in being exclusively wives and mothers. And it's not to say that feminism says you can't be a wife and mother, but the fact is, when that is the only choice, when your choice is taken away, that's kind of the violence of that. So I mean, I think there is an incredible amount of internalized sexism that is that's taught and socialized into people. Just gonna scroll up. Oh, someone asked about I didn't talk about this. Hooks talked about lifestyle feminism, which is a great concept, and it does. I mean, that's fits definitely under the reformist camp. Hooks kind of talks about this more modern occurrence of lifestyle feminism, which is more about like vaguely conceiving of yourself in feminist terms and being generally pro equality, but taking the stance that you don't really have to change anything in the world around you. And so the idea that like, and this, I think this kind of speaks to like a very pop culture ification of feminism, the idea that like, if you listen to a lot of empowering girl music and generally walk with confidence, it's totally fine that capitalism works the way it does. And the idea that like feminism can be kind of like passively achieved. And Hooks takes issue with this because it's inherently passive and it tends to depoliticize people, and it represents feminism as something that you can do without getting all up in your face about it. Um, this is often a criticism of politically active people in general, that politics is too much, is too loud, and that it isn't being kind of like soft and subtle enough. Although, yes, 10 Things I Hate About You is based on Taming of the Shrew, because in the 90s, everyone wanted teen comedies based on Shakespeare. Um, okay, so I think what we're going to do is I'm going to switch over to the film. I'm going to try really quickly to do a screen share. I'm 90% sure this is not going to work, but we're going to learn and experiment together. So give me a moment. Okay, I'm going to press play, and can someone just verbally tell me? Hold on. It's loading. Hmm. Okay, that's not working. That's fine. We're going to try something else. So we are going to take a break as a group. And I'm going to ask you to watch the film on your own in real time. The movie is an hour and 26 minutes. To do math. So I would say let's come back, take a 5-minute break, and let's come back in about an hour and a half. So hold on, I got to figure out my time zone and your time zone. For me, that is going to be 4:15. Why don't we'll come back in 3:15 as a class and we'll do a regroup and we'll discuss the film. So take a few minutes, get yourself a drink of water, stretch, and then I'm going to ask you to watch the movie. If you don't want to watch the movie or if you've already watched the movie, you're free to come back and join us at what did I say? 3:15, 3:15. I like doing this because I like having a conversation right after when it's kind of fresh in our minds. One thing I'll ask you to kind of keep at the front of your mind as you're watching it is how are you comparing this to the readings? Is the movie shifting anything you understood about the feminist movement? Does it contradict it? Does it recontextualize it? How do we think differently about it versus the movement and kind of what we're learning after we've watched the movie? So once again, the movie is Feminist. What Were They Thinking? It is on it's on Netflix, and I will see you all back in an hour and a half. If you are watching the recording asynchronously, I am going to close this recording so you don't get 90 minutes of black screen. So there'll be a second video uploaded. Oh, actually, that's not going to work because then I'm going to kick everyone off. No, that'll be fine. That should be fine. So all of you who are with me synchronously, I'll restart the classroom discussion in an hour and a half. Okay.